Thank you, Gary, for inviting me to this really interesting multidisciplinary group. I just need to find my way through the presentations.
Oops, I think you got it. There you go.
Yeah, just a quick note about myself. I'm based at the Oxford Martin School. I have 2 appointments. The second one is of the Transport Studies Unit. We've developed an expertise on futures thinking for transport. And my talk is going to be very much about how we think about freight for the next 5 decades. So basically, one of the key ideas is that we want to establish generally how we got to this point, how we got to the present. And this is a real problem for all of social science because we disagree. Okay, I have to emphasize that. We disagree on how we got to this point, depending on where you're coming from. And so that's a problem for futures thinking because if you go to the IMF, they can't even agree on how we got to the financial crisis. Just to give you one example. And this is a real problem for thinking forward. That level of disagreement is huge. So we need to define the vision. So I'll talk quickly about the method of futures thinking, in this case, the vision. And I'll identify some of the contexts, the different contexts that will impact how we think about freight. So looking at different factors there, from the managerial side to the technological side. I'll also talk quickly about setting some targets that somehow could be biased because they're socially or ethically desirable targets. And I'll describe the vision in general. Finally, I'll talk about a few policy measures and I'll talk about e-commerce, the role of freight and e-commerce in coordination. Key facts, 95% of oil is powering freight transport, essentially. And that's a real problem for freight, okay? And it's very difficult to get out of this technology, of this fuel situation. Also, I want you to remember that you will not read this in the newspapers. 50% of transport energy use comes from freight, 50%, but we don't see it. It's very different to personal mobility. Personal mobility is very visible. Freight is invisible. There are geopolitical issues as well, accessing to oil and gas and fossil fuel resources. There are freight security issues as well. And we need to diversify from oil. We need to move away from oil towards biomass or probably do less. We also have a problem with carbon pricing, which we haven't talked about. How is it that transport is going to be involved within the European emissions trading system? It's not very clear at the moment how we're going to price carbon. And we could say that it's not really priced, okay? And that would be a real problem for everyone, including the digital economy. Because you have to remember there are also emissions from the digital economy are growing quite rapidly at the moment. They're already close to aviation emissions on a global scale. Aviation emissions are about 2% of global carbon emissions. There are also problems of competitiveness and sustainability. We need to have a low-cost competitive economy, but at the same time, we have to think about sustainability for the next 5 decades. Thinking about visions or scenarios or futures, people always get confused with these terms, okay? So I've got a table here just to quickly explain that there are different ways of looking at the future. One is the traditional predictive way, forecasting methods which are very linear. The second method is to explore. We use the scenarios to explore the future, to explore the what if. Finally, we have normative scenarios, which is really what we want. And in the context of the digital economy, you have to think about what is the ideal future that you would like to achieve, okay? So you have to think about how we could achieve that future. And there has to be some ethical principles behind that, perhaps, or social. or other aspects. So just to make it basic, I really like this, this diagram because it summarizes really well what is it that we're trying to do when we think about visions. So the vision makes things much easier because it closes the future. Okay, if you download one of the reports from Shell, they don't have a vision. They have different scenarios. They don't tell you what is it that they want to get to. Okay, but in this type of methodology that we develop, the idea is to close the future, to make things more manageable. Okay, and if there is no action, you'll go to a very undesirable position. So it's really important to set that desirable target, okay? And as I said to you before, there is a huge disagreement between how we got to the present and how past events shape the present. We have to think about the carbon budget. Okay, whatever we do in the digital economy or in the transport economy, we have only so much carbon to go. Okay, we've got 2,196 billion tons of CO2 left to burn. Okay, once we reach this target, climate science says we're going to have 1 degree extra of temperature. So you've got this much to go, whatever we do, okay? Transport will take the largest share of the carbon budget. And the digital economy has to have a way out of this situation, okay? At the moment, all we see is that probably the digital economy is going to do the opposite. It's actually going to help to eat the carbon budget. Whilst everyone is mitigating, everyone's saving carbon, transportation is going up and up and up. And emissions are growing by 2% per annum on a global scale. And that's when Chinese vehicle consumption, vehicle ownership is extremely low. Once China and India and Brazil catch up, I don't think it's going to be 2%. It could be much higher. Okay? And that's just from the passenger side. We haven't even looked at the freight side. Looking at some of the research that we've done at the Transport Studies Unit, for example, if you read one of the papers that I co-wrote with one of my colleagues, it's the only paper in freight, if you look at the literature, that has actually looked at the growth of the service economy and the manufacturing sector. Okay? Most papers on freight only look at the manufacturing growth and the impact of the heavy industries and the primary industries on freight. But this paper is the only paper, or one of the few papers, that has actually looked at the tertiary sector, okay? And we've also developed, using the VIVAT methodology from Robin Hickman, who is here, and Professor David Bannister, we've applied the VIVAT methodology to freight to think about how freight in Europe is going to develop. Okay, we've also looked at the carbon footprints in a previous activity. So how do we get here? Well, we had a series of technological waves. We have trade growth. We've had, in the last 3 years, we had quite a few trade agreements. I'm going to give you a list of important trade agreements that will definitely have an impact on the digital economy and on freight. We've had massive offshoring from the US to China, from the US to Mexico, from the US and somewhere else. We've also had loss of manufacturing capacity in the UK. But we also had nearshoring, which people don't talk about, which means that you move your production plants beyond the borders of the core in Europe. For example, you move manufacturing capacity to Turkey. So a big question there is, how is the internet economy going to shape some of these supply chain changes? Okay. And we need a freight transport policy that is thinking ahead of everyone else. Okay, These are the different technological waves. You're probably very familiar with this diagram. This is not my diagram. This is from a very famous paper written by Professor Grubler and Nakicenovic at Vienna in 1991. But it's a very useful diagram because it gives you all the technological changes. We've got the market share on the y-axis, and you can see we had canals in the 1700s. In the early 1800s, we had railways and so on. The big question here is e-commerce and e-deliveries or e-freight or e-shipments, is that going to be the next wave? We're just down here, okay, just below 20% market share, but we're moving very rapidly upwards. If you look at Chinese stats on the internet economy, on e-commerce, for example, it's growing exponentially. If you look at the US, it's the same, it's growing very, very rapidly. And we still don't understand how freight is going to be impacted by e-commerce. Looking at the past, I just want to show you here on the y-axis in logarithmic scale, we've got freight transport growth, we've got the different trade blocks, we've got the European Union, 27 member states. It's you can see the growth rate is very close to the American growth rate. You can see Japan in the 1950s had exponential growth, where China was here. Okay, China was here in 1978. Is catching up very quickly. Is caught up now with Japan, as you can see at this point. Okay, so it's the EU. Has been growing very, very slowly, but the volumes of freight transport in Europe are huge, as big as the US, okay? That means the freight has a huge carbon footprint, okay? And obviously, this is all correlated to the structure of trade, which is also changing because of e-commerce, okay? Because you're moving towards the weightless economy. So this is really important for understanding the future of freight. If you look at per capitas, well, it's again, sorry, this is not per capita. This is the same figure. This one is the per capita. Again, you can see that Japan caught up with the US very quickly, but you can see that the EU also has a very high per capita share there. So that means freight activity per population is also very high in Europe. But the key idea here is that Chinese freight transport per capita has now caught up with the European Union in just the space of 2 decades. Very rapid growth. It's extreme growth. Now, the big question here is, what are the cyclical industries that have created the shift, the rapid increase in freight in China? I can tell you there has been rapid huge construction programs since 2008 because of the financial crisis, okay? So that probably shifted the numbers upwards. But there is another major development in China, which is they have probably the largest number of internet users in the world, okay? And they like e-shopping and e-commerce and e-shipments, okay? So that also explains the spike in per capita freight transport. These are just some numbers, just general. It just shows you that most of the freight goes by road in the EU 27 member states. Let's go quickly. Here is just to give you a quick reminder of some of the external factors that are shaping transport growth. And everything started in 1951 when freight was freight was covered only for coal and steel, okay, between France and Germany. So that immediately reduced freight costs between the two countries. And there's been a series of different narratives in the different agreements in the European Union, okay? So there's been other agreements there. There's been also changes in the truck size or lorry size. There's been the adoption of the container. Obviously, the container could become the intelligent container eventually. We've defined the targets. Let's go quickly over this. We've got targets for oil dependency, congestion, and accidents, okay, and carbon emissions. This is part of the vision. We've also looked at the role of e-commerce in the UK. So on the y-axis, we have heavy goods traffic and also private cars. And you can see that there's definitely a very strong growth before the crisis on vans. There's a huge increase in van traffic, and that's obviously correlated to e-commerce. The UK is one of the leading markets in e-commerce, and I'm not surprised because of the high population density and the short haul distances in London and elsewhere in the UK. So the UK has a very favorable transport geography, so to speak, for e-commerce. So we expect further growth in the UK, but you can see that the other countries also have high population density, except Sweden, okay? So there may be other factors that are explaining the growth of e-commerce in Sweden. So remember, e-commerce has grown from 0.2% in 1999 to 5%. Okay, it's a huge increase in the share of the UK economy. So we've identified different measures in our research. I don't want to go through that in too much detail, but we have looked at e-commerce and e-freight within some of these measures. This is the intensity, which is coming down quickly, especially in the United States because of the offshoring of manufacturing capacity, but also probably there could be some e-commerce effect on the decline in intensity, but actually in Europe we don't find that. European freight intensity is rather flat, and if it came down it's because of the financial crisis. So e-commerce is probably not having the same impact in Europe as it is having in the US. Let's skip that. So just to conclude quickly, we've developed a vision of the freight sector in Europe to 2050. We think that global trade will continue to be the key, okay, physical movement of goods will continue to be the key driver for freight transport. But of course, e-commerce will have a substitution effect, but we still don't know exactly which way it's going to go. Okay. We've developed a visioning methodology, but we acknowledge that there are many decision makers within the freight transport industry, and it's very difficult to come up with a common vision, okay? We've also agreed that it's very difficult to decarbonize freight transport, but some of the challenges are whether, for example, e-commerce will complement air freight and road freight, and if it does complement it, that means there will be an increase in the volumes of road freight in the next 2 decades, okay? So these are some of the issues to conclude.
Okay, thank you very much, Dave. Can we thank David? Thank you very much.